really appreciate that I've been invited here to talk about this topic. It's a super important topic. Dixie was referring to my fun and funny little artwork here. This is just a way to have fun and get engaged. I think it's really important. As you listen to my talk, you will see I am not a geologist, I'm not a paleontologist, but as a person who studies plant responses to climate, I was introduced to this concept of looking back at the past to understand what the future might hold. And it's a really powerful approach, and I want to share that with you guys today. So I think generally when people think about climate change, they're thinking about something like this. So this is an artistic visualization of a future climate change scenario. And it's based on what they call a consensus model, which is a way that they basically take tons and tons of data from all different kinds of sources, and they try to use different scenarios, and they try to make a prediction of what will the globe be like in 100 years. So as you can see from this visualization, this is looking at a 4°C warmer world, which is a pretty extreme scenario, pretty extreme climate warming scenario. And what you see is the prediction is that the Arctic will turn green. The mid-latitudes will have various results, but a lot of desertification, especially in this region that we know as a Rhodo region. And then some places would actually be buried underneath the ocean. I think the important thing to think about is that this is basically compiled from thousands of independent data sources. And one of the things that really characterizes these consensus models is an extensive effort to account for uncertainty. And so I'm actually part of that extensive effort to account for uncertainty. I'm one person. I'm going to give you a boots on the ground tour of what one person is doing to investigate one aspect of uncertainty. And the aspect that I address really is the physiology and the ecology of the plants themselves. So this artistic visualization is trying to take into account everything we know, but I think you're going to see that everything we know ends up being a small part of what the whole picture is. And I think the critical thing to know is that a lot of times climate change science is criticized for this uncertainty. But I think the most important thing from the science perspective is that we know more than anybody the uncertainty involved. And that's what makes us want to be cautious. Uncertainty should dictate caution in making decisions that can alter components of a system. So why is there so much uncertainty? Well, we're new. And just there's a lot of uncertainty in the system. So this is just a little graphic demonstration of how young humans are. So this little clock shows you the history of Earth in 12 hours. So for the first almost the whole 12 hours, there's no humans. Humans are actually this little dot, you can't even see them. So the reality is our perspective as humans is very limited. And so we need to think about that. We don't have, climate change is something that occurs over millennia, and we haven't even really been around for very many millennia. And so add to that, the system has a lot of uncertainty. So we're trying to predict the outcome of changes in a highly complex system. And by highly complex, just think about the fact that there are 8.7 million species on Earth, approximately, and 12.2 billion hectares of land on Earth. And we're trying to figure out what every plant in every place is going to do. That's a huge task. But I really love this quote from Louisa May Alcott, and this is what I sort of cling to as a climate scientist. I'm not afraid of storms, for I am learning how to sail my ship. So climate research and the work that I do to contribute to it really is centered on how do we sail this ship called Earth? How do we maintain our own lives? How do we maintain the resources that we depend on humans? And how do we learn to sail this ship of Earth so that we can continue, on and on and on into the future? So the good news is, even though we're not new, climate change actually isn't new at all. And in fact, humans have been thinking about it for the entirety of our short little itty bitty history. And the Greeks had a concept of climate change, and Aristotle, who's often thought of as the first biologist, he reflected on the consequences of the Mycenaean drought that occurred around 1200 BC. And so here's the ruins of the Mycenaean culture. And at that time, the Greeks thought about, wow, was climate change an aspect of how that culture declined? And a thinker named Theophrastus also broached the idea that man-made climate change could happen. And then flash forward, a couple of thousand years to when science came back into the main view, and we get geology in the Age of Reason. And so this is an image of geologic strata. And geology is really sort of where climate change science really starts to get going, because they basically use geology to show that climate change and a change in the landscape was actually a part of the natural cycles of the ancient Earth. And so this is a composite image of everything that geologists and climate scientists have really learned about the natural cycles of the Earth. And what they've learned is that climate change is really as old as life itself. So what you see here is the colors represent the relative temperature of Earth. So this is the oldest point, 4,600 million years ago. No life on Earth at this time. It was very hot. And basically you see this black line shows you the relative temperature of the Earth. So if we take the mean temperature of the Earth, this line is showing us when it's getting colder, it's blue. And then when it's getting a lot hotter, it's red. And what you can see is that over time, natural geologic cycles have interacted with the process of the continents moving around, or tectonic movement. And you see this change in the temperature of the Earth as a natural aspect of the Earth. So before humans even came on into the picture, the Earth was doing this. And the other thing that you can see very clearly when you look at the geologic record is that when you increase atmospheric CO2, you get an increase in the global temperature. So every place you see that it's red and the temperature is warmer than average, that's associated with a high carbon dioxide level. So that concept of the climate having changed over a vast amount of time also goes along with this idea that living organisms can alter global climate. And what do I mean by that? Well, I'm particularly going to focus on plants here because they have been insanely powerful in determining what the climate on Earth looks like. And there are two periods on Earth where you can see in the geologic record that CO2 depletion by plants and then subsequent sequestration of that plant matter underground contributed to ice ages. So one of these is about 350 million years ago, right at the end of the Carboniferous. So the Carboniferous is really cool because that's when the first trees evolved. That is a time when the largest trees on Earth really sprung up, and it was a heyday for them. They grew and they multiplied and they really had no competition. And what they did is they actually sequestered that carbon in their wood, and the wood fell down underground. And it's thought that at that time, the fungi and the bacteria that can actually eat wood weren't evolved yet. And so the wood fell down and it just sat there. Nothing rotted it. It just sat until it became buried. And you see the evidence that this actually was a contributing factor to the Permian Ice Age, because right after wood evolves, you see a major drop in CO2 and the climate flips to an ice age. And this was one of the biggest ice ages on Earth in the history of Earth, and it did cause mass extinctions. There was a forest in Antarctica, and there's fossil evidence of this Antarctic forest. There's a more recent example. There was a massive azala bloom, which is an algae, and a water plant. Sorry, I don't want to confuse algae with water plants. And that occurred around 50 million years ago, right here at the end of the Eocene. And that was thought to start the beginning of a global cool down that I'll talk about more. So the important thing to think about is when you look at these mass extinction events, this is what often makes people very worried about future climate change, right? How is if climate change is often followed by mass extinctions, what's going to happen to us, right? Well, I think the important thing to think about there is that these are actually also followed by evolutionary innovations. So mass extinctions open up niches. So whereas the dinosaurs and the dinosaurs were basically extinct after the Cretaceous, things like flowering plants, mammals, birds all evolved with this new climate. So on top of that really shows us that organisms can respond and survive in the face of change. And temperature and water stress are really key factors of climate change that determine the distribution of living organisms on Earth. And when you look at the plant and animal life that we know as humans today, all of that evolved during a global cool down that lasted about 50 million years and culminated in the last ice ages. So that time when that azala bloom happened, the CO2 was drawn down, our climate flipped. And you can see in this diagram, starting around 50 million years ago, the climate has been cooling and cooling and cooling and cooling. And here we are in modern day. So we're actually at the end of a major ice age in Earth's history. Now, on top of that, this geologic record helps us understand what's going on now. And when we make measurements, say over the last 60 years about is what we have data from with modern instruments, we see this very close association with the CO2 that was sequestered in those fossil fuels during the Carboniferous. So as those first trees died and their wood just buried underground, it became fossil fuels. Now we're burning that, we're releasing it into the atmosphere. And if you look across all of geologic history, the temperature is actually changing faster today than any other time along this. So, you know, you look at this big dip, that's 500 million years that change happened. We are making changes today faster than any other time in geologic history. So the question really is, how will the biological resources that we depend on be impacted by this? And the reality that I work on is this idea that in a warming world, these ice age adaptations could be detrimental. So you only have to look at the story of woolly mammoths and woolly rhinos to realize that organisms that were adapted to this ice age are not going to do great necessarily in a warmer world. We recognize that organisms have their ecological niche. So as you change that ecological niche, they may have issues dealing with the new environment. So now we're coming to, this is the work that I do. So my work really focuses on how will climate change impact plant performance and survival. So across all of history, across all of time, there are really three responses that can happen. One is that plants and animals can move to track the suitable habitat. So you see this in geologic history, organisms migrated to track the environment that they were adapted to. But the reality is that migration is super slow, especially if you're a rhododendron. We all know that they are not great migrators. And the suitable habitat may not be available. So you think about rhodos being really located on mountain slopes in nature. There's a top of the mountain. And so eventually they'll run out of mountain. And so one possibility is that populations could go extinct. And we have evidence of that in the geologic record. But another option that I really spend my time thinking about is that you can actually acclimate or evolve climate tolerance. In other words, your climate tolerance may change in response to the change in climate. And that's what we've seen over and over again throughout the history of Earth. The climate tolerance of the living things on Earth really evolve and acclimate to be able to thrive in the climate that exists. So my work focuses on using genus Rhododendron as a model system to understand plant acclimation and adaptation to climate. And you don't have to look too far to see that it's really a cool study system from this perspective. When you want to study acclimation and adaptation, you need diversity. And rhodos are like, you know, the king of diversity. Everywhere you look, they have different leaf types, different habitats. They're just a really, really neat system from that perspective. So what I want to do is I want to help you get this, what I call the paleo perspective on climate change. So when I was doing my training, I did my postdoctoral research at the University of Kansas. And they have a very eminent paleobotany department. And I went specifically to that school to try to develop a better understanding of evolution. And this was a revolution in my mind of how I thought about plant responses to climate change. So I'm going to tell you a really neat story first that was proposed by Irving and Hebda in a 1993 JARS paper. And you can go and look this up. It's a great paper. It really explains in very clear language their theory for the origin and the distribution of rhododendron. And what you see in their theory is that by using a combination of geology, paleoecology, and the distribution of the plants on Earth, that they're really able to gain some insight into the fact that climate played a critical role in the evolution of rhododendron diversity. So this is an image from their paper, and this is the distribution of genus Rhododendron that they drew in their paper. And then they used evidence from the paleo record, and then they also used concepts from, you know, geology and climate modeling to come up with this theory. And so they noted three things that really needed to be explained about the evolution of rhododendron. First, they noted that they really have this strong association with montane or alpine locations. They are a montane genus. They also noted the highest diversity is in the eastern Himalayas, the southern part of Tibet, and in Malaysia. So this black region here. And they also noted that in this region with a lot of species, you have a lot of ecological niches in a small geographic area. So there's many kinds of habitats. These areas are really mountainous. And so you have many choices. Do you want to be at the bottom of the valley and be warm, or be at the top of the valley and be sunny? Lots of niches. They also noted that there are scattered species all across the northern hemisphere. So that's what these dots represent. And they indicated that this probably shows that there were larger populations at one time that became isolated over time. The last thing they noted is that rhodos are excluded from deserts and semi-arid grasslands. So this is going to be important later when we talk about my research in physiology. So what's the story that Irving and Hebda told? Well, they focused first on the fact that at the end of the Cretaceous, there was a giant change and a big disaster. So what happened? The Chicxulub crater crashed into the Yucatan Peninsula, and there was a massive global climate change, and the dinosaurs went extinct. So this is our sort of general view of what the late Cretaceous looked like, just fire and brimstone disaster, right? But the reality is it was actually not just an end, but it was also a beginning. So reptiles didn't actually disappear. They became the smaller reptiles that we know. Dinosaurs didn't disappear. They became basically smaller reptiles and birds, which is a story for another day. But although things like Tyrannosaurus and the sort of iconic dinosaurs went extinct, there were a lot of individuals that were basically able to survive and adapt to the new conditions. And not the least of which is the flowering plants. The flowering plants are basically what we think of today generally when we think of a plant. And rhododendrons were right there. The first rhododendron is thought to have arisen about 68 million years ago, right at this time when we sort of have this vision of our mind of a climate disaster. So back at that time, there was a warmer climate. It was hotter. But we also have to remember that there were still temperature gradients. So it was still hotter in the central part of the globe, and it was still colder towards the poles. And this little region is what you want to watch, because that's where rhodos first appeared. And sort of coincidentally, right around the time that the climate sort of was entering a cooling phase, you get the rise of the Himalayas. So the Indian subcontinent was basically starting to really smash into the Asian continent. And this region where rhodos will eventually show up was starting to uplift. So not only is it getting colder, but you're getting basically a mountain. So where you are is even getting colder and colder. And so right around 40 million years ago, that was the beginning of an ice age. And this is part of that global cool down that I described to you. And so here's our little rhodo, our ancient rhodo in the newly uplifted Himalayas. And we're going to see what happens to him over the next 40 million years. So basically the idea is that when when the climate sort of switches to what they call an ice age, there's actually cycles within that. So it'll get much colder for a while, then it'll get a little warmer, then it'll get colder. So you get that back and forth. And the warmer parts are called an interglacial cycle. And what happens at that time is that populations can expand, because you think about the fact that plants are happier, it's a little bit warmer, it's not as stressful. So everybody's doing well and they can grow well and expand. But then when you flip to a glacial cycle, what happens is you actually get shrinkage of populations. And in some cases, what was once a very large population could be cut off from each other because the locations where they live shrink. So if you think about plants that are growing across a mountain range, if the climate cools, you might see that plants in the valleys survive and plants higher up die. And the connection between these groups of plants is cut. So now they're effectively, basically isolated populations. These isolated populations are what people sometimes call glacial refugia. So it's a place where the plant can actually escape. It's a refuge from this very stressful climate. And what happens is when those populations are disconnected, genetic differences can actually accumulate over time. And that's what we call evolution. So during these times when the populations are disconnected, you could actually get speciation, where ancient rhodo is now actually 2 species of rhodo. Next interglacial cycle, the populations can expand again and maybe even come back together. And then in the next cycle, you get that again, where they get isolated into these refugia. And then that allows these genetic differences to accumulate over time. And now we have 4 species instead of 2. So you can see this pattern as these glacial interglacial cycles go back and forth. And that's how it's thought that rhododendrons basically evolved many, many species. And today, depending on how you count them, there's 900. So that basically took place over the last 40 or 50 million years. Now, that was a really, really great thought piece by Irving and Hebda that was based on geology. And the idea about how the evolution of rhodos went was based on the theories of evolution. And a neat thing happened in 2018 is a new paper came out that basically used genetic evidence and more sort of modern paleoclimate modeling. And they really completely support that theory that was posed by Irving and Hebda. So this is a map of the diversity of rhododendron on planet Earth. And anywhere it's green, you have 1 to 3 species. So North America, we don't have a lot here. We've got 1 to 3. But these red places are the species hot zones. So same places that were identified by Irving and Hebda, this Himalayan region and then Malaysia have the highest species diversity today. And their paleoclimate, their models also really show, yes, these do have the most variable climate conditions in these places where the species are most rich. The genetics also adds new information that wasn't present in that former paper, and it adds information about species ages. So you can basically use genetics to find out how old is this species, what time period did it evolve? And this is surprising because what you see is the green region shows that species are the youngest. So most of the species are very young. And the red region shows most of the species are very old. And this is surprising because generally when you see a place where there are a lot of species, you might think, oh, that's an old region where there's been a lot of species just sitting there over time. But actually what you see is the places where you have the most species have the most young species. And what that indicates is a really recent and rapid evolution of diversity in these regions. Now, they also use this genetic evidence to test that theory by Irving and Hebda about where and when the first rhodos appear. And their data really supports this idea that about 65 million years ago in the mountains of Northeast Asia, so this region, that was the origin of rhododendron. And so that really fits with Irving and Hebda's concept. They also talk about a recent and rapid into the tropics adaptive radiation. So moving from Northeast Asia into the tropics. And there's likely a series of colonization events. And as I go through the work that I've done, you're going to see that this is actually weird. And if you look at all plants on Earth, this is a very odd pattern. In fact, most species on Earth start in the tropics, their origins are in the tropics, and they move towards the poles. So rhodos have done a weird thing here, and that's worth noting, and we'll talk a little bit more about it. So let's get into what this actually means. Who are these plants that we have today? And I'm going to start with this map of the global distribution. There's a site called the Global Biodiversity Information Facility where people can record observations of plants. And this is a map that just shows you everywhere a person observed a rhododendron. Now, you're probably going to call me out for Egypt. They don't grow there, do they? But that's a botanical garden. So this includes botanical garden data, but also it includes natural occurrences. I include botanical garden data here because what you know is that these plants are capable of being cultivated in these locations. But you note that they are absent here, and we'll talk about that more later. But who are they? Who are these plants? Well, I'm going to give you a very, very general, and I want you guys to take this with a grain of salt because I know how much you know about rhodos. But what I want to do is sort of characterize how lineages have evolved. So I'm not talking about a particular species. I'm talking about a general concept for these lineages. So when you look at the lepidotes, the black circles show generally where they can be found on Earth. And they really are specialists with the tundra. So you get a few species, but great large populations up here in the tundra. And they really like those sunny montane slopes here in Asia. Now, the lepidotes are really more common in temperate montane forests, and we'll talk more about what that means. But you find them sort of in these montane regions across the globe. The deciduous azaleas, they're going to be more sort of a sunny slope species, and you find them in these three regions across the globe. And the evergreen azaleas are actually specialized in a sun-drenched volcanic hill slope. And then the last one is the vireas. And so the vireas are really the ones that make it to the tropics. And as I tell you about the physiology of rhododendrons, what you'll see is that they really had to adopt an epiphytic, which means living in the trees, or a semi-terrestrial lifestyle to make that happen. And we'll talk more about that. All right, so the question when you look at these maps and these distributions that I alluded to is why don't we find them in deserts? So basically nowhere where it's dry. You don't find them in semi-arid grasslands. And when you look at most of the tropics, they're not in the tropics of Africa. They're not in the tropics of the New World. They're not really a tropical group except for these little weirdos, the vireas down here. So what's going on? Why? Well, my work is really focused on this idea that their current distribution is shaped by a physiological legacy of evolution in the montane regions of an ice age world. So just like that woolly mammoth, these are ice age creatures. And there are aspects of ways of living that they developed during the Ice Age that present a problem for them when they move into warmer places. So how do we think about this legacy concept when it comes to plants? Well, it really is just like your legacy. This is the Rockefellers, a family that I'm sure we all would like to have in our legacy for various reasons. And we could just think of this family tree as being very similar to the family tree of plants. They have ancestors, plants do, and they are the descendants of those ancestors. So what traits do these descendants, do these modern plants have that are really holdovers from their ancestors? You know, it could be a good trait like buckets of money in an endowment, or it could be a bad trait. Like, I don't know what the bad traits, you know, you might want to key in on the Rockefellers, but I'm sure there's some traits that their descendants carry forward that weren't always necessarily helpful for them. So really my work is looking at this from the perspective of asking, what are the adaptations that plants have for current climates? And what are the adaptations that are the holdovers from that Ice Age climate where they're from? So I'm going to tell you a couple of stories that really address how ancient climate adaptations can impact the response of rhodos to future climate. And I'm going to address 4 questions. First, we'll look at, could ancestral traits be detrimental in a climate change scenario? Then we'll look at, do rhodos vary in their ability to meet the new climate challenge? And for these 2 questions, I'm going to show you a comparison across clades with different leaf types. Next, I'm going to ask, are species adapted to current climate? And can they acclimate to a change in climate? So this is going to be a comparison of climate tolerance that we did across rhododendron minus populations that are from different climates. So what are ancestral adaptations to frost and why would they matter? Well, the primary one that I'm going to talk about today is in the plant vascular system. So this is just a random lovely rhodo in the mountains. And this is a cross-sectional image of what it would look like if you cut open the leaf. So if you just slice this leaf open, this is the midrib vein. That's that little stringy line that goes, whoops, right down the center of the leaf. And this tissue is really, really important when it comes to temperature tolerance because this is the system that supplies water to the leaves. So without a functional vascular system, you would die, and plants also need a functional vascular system. And frost can cause what they call an embolism in the veins. And it's just like an embolism in a human, it's an air bubble and it blocks the flow. So water is the lifeblood of plants. And so frost basically makes them have an embolism in their vascular tissue. Now, the size of the vascular tissue is really critical because small xylem vessels are less prone to this frost damage. And what you see when you look at rhododendrons is, geez Louise, all of them have very, very tiny xylem vessels. So this is an image that shows the frequency distribution of vessel diameters across all angiosperms, so all flowering plants for which we have data. And what you see is that the size ranges from very small, close to 0, all the way up into about 300 microns. Now look at the Ericaceae, which is the family that rhodos are in. They do have small vessels, but look at rhodos, that's this hot pink. In fact, rhododendrons have some of the smallest xylem vessels on Earth. They have some of the smallest xylem vessels on Earth. That is a critical feature of who they are and how they respond in life. And the reason why they likely all have this trait is that survival in that ancestral habitat depended strongly on this xylem frost resistance. So that ability to live over that 50 million years of climate cool down that culminated in the last ice age pivoted on this trait. This is a trait that helped them survive to be the plants that we know and love today. Now, there's a big trade-off because actually smaller vessels can be super detrimental when things get hot. So this is an image. Here's the one in the center that I showed you before. This is an image of lots of different petioles, or different leaf veins from a lot of different rhodos. And what you see is that the orange colored cells are lots of different sizes. And the fact is, a larger xylem vessel can transport more water. Just like if you have a tiny hose, you're going to get a little drip to your plants. You want a nice big hose to deliver water quickly. Xylem vessels that are larger can do that. So if you have large xylem vessels, you can keep your stomata open longer. You can do a lot more photosynthesis. And also you have a better ability to evaporatively cool your leaves during hot times. So when the sun shines on a leaf and it's very hot, that water evaporating off is acting just like an evaporative cooling air conditioner. And if you have less water to transport, you have less ability to cool your leaf that way. The other thing is that plants with larger vessels are better competitors when frost is absent. If you have not a lot of water and another guy has more water, it's going to grow really fast and it's going to shade you out. And I know you guys know this because weeds and rhodos are a constant battle, right? They grow slowly and that is their jam. They are well adapted to this stressful, ice age climate, and they grow slowly because they don't expect to have a competitor that's growing fast next to them. So this seems really bad at first. And when I first started thinking about this, I thought, geez, maybe rhodos are just going to go extinct. And that was a little scary because they're so awesome. But over the last 8 years that we've been working on this problem, we've really come to this idea of, could leaf diversity solve the problem? So this is an old image of leaf diversity. You guys know this with every, cell of your being, that the leaf diversity of rhodos is really one of the things that we love about them. And in reality, the water supply is really about how much water you have per unit leaf area. So I have a budget of water and I have so much to spend, and each leaf is going to spend an amount of water. And so we're going to look at data that shows that basically it's about how plants play with the relationship between their vascular system and their leaves. The other thing that rhodos have is weird, awesome, strange traits of their leaves. So leaf hairs, they have epidermal traits. All of this can alter the water needs. So we basically asked this question, do rhodos vary in their ability to meet the new climate challenge? And we wanted to compare and contrast leaf and xylem traits for 3 clades with different leaf types. And we did this at 2 gardens. So we looked at Ponticum, Pentanthera, and Tsutsutsi. And we did this both at Holden and at the Rhododendron Species Foundation. I won't have time today to show you all the data across the 2 gardens. So we'll just look at it as sort of a combined concept. So I'm going to show you all of the data pictorially so that you can sort of get a handle on what the big picture concept is without slogging through a bunch of graphs. So what we found is that essentially Pentanthera have smaller branch leaf area than Ponticum. And we all know this, your deciduous azaleas always have a few leaves on the tip of every branch, and those Ponticums like to load up their branches with lots and lots of gorgeous leaves. The trick is though, unexpectedly, the Pentanthera actually have a bigger water supply to their leaves. So this is backwards, right? If you have fewer leaves, you don't think you'd need as much water. You'd think this guy would need a lot more water because he's got a lot of leaves. But it actually turns out that the Ponticums have a very low water supply per leaf area. Now, what does this mean functionally? Well, it means that these Pentanthera leaves can actually grow faster. They have more water per leaf area, so they can open their stomata and photosynthesize and do all that good stuff. And if they start to run out of water, they have this really neat trait, is they're deciduous. I don't know how many of you have seen Pentanthera sort of give up the ghost a little bit too early if it gets droughty in the fall, but they come right back. So they have this trait that they can basically escape the stress by dropping these leaves. Now, they grow fast, they escape stress. On the other hand, these ponticum leaves, they don't do that. They hang on to those leaves for dear life. The leaves are thick, they're very expensive to make, and their strategy is just to keep those leaves. And so what happens is their leaves actually are undersupplied with water. They tend to have this low supply of water to the leaves. Other work we've done has shown that the leaves, while they're very large, they're also very leaky. So they tend to lose water out of the epidermis, whereas the Pentanthera don't. And so what that means is ponticum is actually water limited compared to Pentanthera. And a funny thing is that this makes sense if you live in a shady tree canopy. In a shady tree canopy, you can imagine one leaf, like this blue leaf, might be in the sun, and this purple leaf might be in the shade. In that case, you really want this leaf in the sun to work harder because it's got sunbeams. So you want to give it as much water as it can use and let it keep its stomata open. This shade guy, you might not mind if it's not doing much because it's in the shade. And so ponticum branches are really optimized for a shady lifestyle. The leaves are all competing for water, and the sun leaves are going to win the water at the end of the day. That's great because those sun leaves can do more photosynthesis, but actually it means they're going to use a lot more water because they're going to have this higher evaporation rate. And that could get really, really bad if the humidity drops, or if that water demand of those sun leaves really outstrips the supply that they have. So they can grow a little faster, but only safely in the shade. Now, my favorite group, we can debate about this, about why Tsutsutsi is my absolute favorite group of rhododendrons, and this is partly why. They actually have a really small leaf area because they have tiny leaves, but their leaves are very watertight, and they also have a disproportionately large water supply per leaf area, which means they can go really fast under good conditions. They can just crank open those stomata and photosynthesize like the day is never going to end. And not only that, they can acclimate by changing their leaf properties and their leaf area really, really easily and quickly. So you guys have all seen their fall leaf color. That's an aspect of this. They're able to basically always be prepared, and they're always able to supply enough water so that those leaves can get their work done, even under hot or dry conditions. So what are the implications of these data for rhododendron in a changing world? Well, the reality is that altered precipitation regimes are expected with climate change. And this can cause what we call atmospheric drought, which means just dry air. And when we look at the deciduous azaleas, we think, you know, the leaves could dehydrate in dry air. But the fact that they lose their leaves under stress really protects them, because now the rest of the plant is not going to dehydrate, and it has that chance to come back when conditions get better. These Tsutsutsis just are masters of this. The fact that these evergreen azaleas can grow in the Midwest, you know, is a testament to the fact that they are always prepared and they are doing better in dry air habitats. Now, the one that looks the worst is these ponticums. Especially if you have a lot of sunlit leaves, dry air is going to be the death of them. And, you know, climate change is also likely to increase soil drought, and water or an azalea data is certainly going to help it. Save a ponticum that's in full sun, because its leaves are going to be water limited. Now, I'm going to hurry up and tell you this really cool story because I think I'm running out of time. This is a neat project that we've been working on, and I have not published a paper on yet, so you're just going to have to wait a little bit longer. And this is a project where we looked at rhododendron minus. So these are a bunch of rhododendron minus plants in our lab house at Holden. And we asked the question, are these species adapted to current climate change, and can they acclimate? This is a map of the distribution of rhododendron minus, and every hashed county is a place where they occur. And these dots show locations where Steve Krebs went and collected seeds from those populations. He brought the seeds back to Holden, and then we grew them all together in this common garden, and we exposed them to fall and winter, and we just watched what they did. So the idea is that if you grow them all together, you can see genetic differences and you can see acclimation. So acclimation is that ability of plants to make a change in response to current conditions. So when your rhododendrons are drooping their leaves, that's an acclimation response. The leaves droop and then they can come back. So acclimation is really rapid and it can be accomplished by a single individual plant. The difference is adaptation. It is a thing that an individual plant has, but an adaptation is a population level process. So remember back when I was telling you about the glacial-interglacial cycles and the populations getting isolated? Think about it in this context. These populations do not exchange pollen with these populations way down here. So they are effectively isolated from one another. And there's been a lot of debate in this community about whether these plants in these southern populations are actually a different species. So is there evolution going on right now where we're getting a cold adapted and a warm adapted species out of one species, Rhododendron minus? So I'm not going to show you all of the data because it's pretty extensive. But what I'm going to tell you is the results. So these are 4 images of the 4 of the populations we looked at. Hawksbill and Graveyard Field are from cold climates, and Haynes Island and Sprewell Bluff are from warm climates. We found that these species from warm climates grew faster than the cold climate species. They didn't have very much leaf curling or drooping in response to cold. And they also had a down regulation of photoprotective pigments. So what does that mean? See these red and orange colors? Those are photoprotective pigments. So in the fall, when you get this coloration on your evergreens, that's actually a pigment that protects chlorophyll. So when it's cold out, your metabolism is slow and you can't grow. And at the same time, light is arriving at your leaf. And especially for evergreens, they actually get more light in the winter because that canopy of other trees that would cover them is gone. And just like you, if you sit out in the sun for a really long time, you'll get a sunburn. Well, if the plant can't actually use the light that's arriving at the leaf surface to do photosynthesis, that light energy will destroy the leaf. It will damage it, it will ruin it, just like it destroys your skin. So these pigments actually are generated in the plant in the fall to protect the chlorophyll, so that when the plants sort of emerge in the spring, they're not damaged, but they just have this ability to acclimate to those cold conditions. So we really found that the color, the fall color and those photoprotection was really lacking in those southern populations. The other thing that the southern populations did is that they actually waited till a light frost to acclimate, whereas these cold populations started to acclimate as soon as we had short days. So the cold populations were saying, ooh, winter's coming, I better hunker down. And they were doing all these physiological processes to sort of shut down their growth and protect themselves from the cold. And these southern populations did not do that. They merrily went along their way, enjoying warm fall days and growing and doing whatever they wanted. And then when winter came, they went, oh no, and they hunkered down at that last moment. So this gives those southern populations a chance to grow on warm fall and spring days. So if you think about climates in the South, you might get cold and you might get frost, but it's short-lived. And you're really likely to get these warm fall or spring days. So if you're able to grow on that warm fall or spring day, you might get an advantage over your neighbor. But if you're like these northern populations and you're just going to hunker down at the first sign of fall, there's no way you can respond to that warm fall day. You're just sitting there waiting for spring to fully come. So that thing we were joking about with false spring, that's really a thing for plants. False spring is not going to trick these northern populations. They are not waking up till it's time. And I can tell you, I have a Rhododendron ostrinum in my yard that just, its leaves don't fall off in the winter. They get frozen and they're still on the plant today because it just doesn't have that concept of acclimating. I will say, actually, all of the populations survived one of the coldest days ever here. They survived a -24 Celsius, which is way colder than anything they see in their native habitats. That's pointing right back to their ancestry. It doesn't matter how warm it is in Georgia, these plants know cold. They have that ancestry of cold adaptation, and it's with them today. So what are the implications of these data for climate change? Well, there's this legacy of frost tolerance. We don't really know yet, and we're going to continue to work on the study system. We don't know what that really means for these southern populations. Can they escape that legacy? Our data does show that acclimation can bridge the gap to help survive rapid change. So those plants that waited until winter, they survived, they acclimated, it was okay. They had this ability to rapidly respond. But our data also shows that evolution is happening right now in these populations. This study gives credence to all of you who think R- should be split into 2 species. Please don't lord it over your friends, though, because I know this is a debate that we're still having. And it really shows there's more to those differences than leaf color or leaf shape, flower color. These are physiological differences. And what we're doing now is we're actually doing a genetic study to ask how closely related are all these species. And we can look and see what's the genetic variation among them. So stay tuned. We'll tell you more about this as time goes on, but we're going to be looking at the genetic differences across these populations. All right, the last thing I want to do is I want to bring it back to the vireas. And I want to remind you that I said it was weird that rhodos had this pattern of diversifying into the tropics. And based on what I just told you, rhododendrons should be bad at the tropics because they have this legacy, this ancient small vascular tissue legacy. And yet the vireas really had this rapid and recent evolution into this tropical region. And the reality is the way they accomplished that is by becoming epiphytes. Now you do find them terrestrially a little bit, but for the most part, they're living in a low competition niche that's higher up in the canopy, so they don't have to compete for light. That's an evolutionary innovation, and it's unexpected. And that's the key in thinking about how organisms survive climate change. We don't actually know the tricks that they have up their sleeves. And vireas are a really great example of that. Now, I would say vireas, comparatively little is known about their physiology. We need like 1,000 new scientists to study this. But there was a fabulous paper by Juliana and Nilsson on idioblasts. So this is a cross section of a virea leaf. And here's where the photosynthetic cells are. So light's going to hit this surface. They have these cells called idioblasts, which are just giant water droplets. Other rhododendrons do not have these. Eric Nilsson has looked extensively, and these exist, these evolved in the vireas. So virea is going to basically be able to, when times are good, it's going to fill these idioblasts with water. And then when times are bad, that's a resource. So they have this xylem tissue that can't supply a lot of water, but they've got a backup. They've got water stored. And so these vireas really show that tropics puzzle can be solved. They can move into a hotter climate. So let's wrap everything up here and return to that question of what can the past tell us about the future of rhododendron in a changing world? Well, I hope this boots on the ground tour that I gave you of what I do and how I contribute to this climate change question. I hope you can see how complex it is. So if anybody tells you they know the answer, tell them to call me and I'll give them a little bit of complexity. And the reality is, from the perspective of people who study climate change, I think being aware that the vastness of what is unknown dwarfs what is known. We have a lot of data, we have a lot of information, we're making a lot of progress, but our perspective is new and there's just a lot of factors. And I think I would like to come back to that idea that uncertainty is what dictates our caution. We are uncertain. Ultimately, we can run models, we can put all this data in the model and make these predictions, but nobody really knows what the outcome is. And so from my perspective, going back to Louisa May Alcott, let's not be afraid of let's not be afraid of the storm. Let's learn how to sail our ship. And that is really about asking these questions about how the organisms will respond. And I hope you saw how awesome this paleoclimate perspective is. It really gives you a grounding. And when you add it to that experimental data, it really helps us see that rhododendron can acclimate and adapt to climate change. There is hope. They have this evolutionary legacy of frost tolerance, which will make them vulnerable to heat and drought. But we also know that they can acclimate, and that's a key feature of everything we've seen in rhododendron. We've seen Pentanthera, Tsutsutsi, and Viria actually have really creative solutions to solve that legacy problem. But the reality is that Ponticum, I think, is the most vulnerable physiologically. And I think our data really show that keeping it shady is going to be a key feature. Our R- study shows that evolution is happening now in natural populations. And it also shows that populations are likely to have different fates. Species are likely to have different fates. So I'm going to give one last important caveat. No matter what we do in terms of climate change studies, habitat conservation is critical. If we want plants to be able to acclimate, to move, to evolve, they need space and they need time. So conserving those habitats is going to be one of the best things that we can do for rhododendron. And not only that, but ex situ conservation provides a lifeline. And what do I mean by that? Your garden can be a climate change refugia. You only need a few individuals of a species to bring it back from extinction. They're still looking for dinosaurs in amber, and your gardens can be a climate change refugia. And with that, I'm just going to acknowledge my co-authors and my collaborators that went into the work that I showed you and these funding sources. And I'm going to stop sharing my screen and invite questions.